Everyone laughed when he bought and moved into a rusty train car. But everything changed when people looked inside, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning light crept reluctantly through the cracked blinds of the apartment, illuminating the peeling paint on the walls and the sagging ceiling stained by time and leaks. Jeremiah Brooks sat at the edge of his worn-out bed, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on a chipped coffee mug half filled with lukewarm instant brew. The radiator behind him rattled softly, coughing heat with an irregular sputter, the only sound breaking the silence that had hung in the apartment for what felt like years. At 52, Jeremiah had learned how to live with silence. It clung to him like a second skin, an ever-present weight that settled on his shoulders after the world he knew crumbled piece by piece. The apartment was barely furnished. A rusted metal bed frame, a small round table in the corner, 2 mismatched chairs, and a bookshelf that now stood empty except for a cracked photo frame. Inside it, a younger version of him stood beside a woman with warm eyes and a radiant smile. Linda, his wife, his world. She had been gone for 3 years now, ovarian cancer. The diagnosis had come too late, the insurance too thin, the system too cold. Jeremiah had done everything he could, sold the car, drained the savings, begged for extensions at work. He had held her hand in the final days, whispered stories of their youth into her ear, as if words could reverse time. She passed in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, her fingers curled around his. Afterward, the world grew quieter, harsher. He took a slow sip of his coffee and grimaced at the bitter taste. There was a time he had woken up to fresh toast, the smell of eggs sizzling, Linda humming softly in the kitchen. Now his mornings were colorless, repetitive, mechanical. Unfold the same blanket, shuffle to the same sink, avoid the same mirror. He no longer looked at his reflection. He already knew what he would see. Gray stubble overtaking his chin, eyes heavy with sleeplessness, the curve of grief etched permanently into his brow. Bills were piled up on the table, unopened. He knew what they said. He didn't need to read them. The utilities were past due, and the rent was barely paid by the disability checks and what little odd jobs he could still find. They had shut down the assembly line where he worked, another casualty in Detroit's long, slow collapse. His knees weren't what they used to be, and his back carried more than its fair share of years and hard labor. He glanced toward the window, where a dull winter sun strained against the frost. Another gray day. Another empty one. His eyes dropped to the small box beside the table. Inside were her letters. Some dried flowers she had once pressed into the pages of an old hymnal, and a folded deed, one he hadn't looked at in over 20 years. It was for a plot of land in North Carolina, near where his grandfather once lived. A forested ridge with a rusted fence and a creaky gate, nothing of value on it except trees and memory. Jeremiah reached for his phone out of habit, opened a browser without thinking. The screen flickered to life. He tapped through listings, glancing absently through old tools, vintage radios, used bicycles. Nothing caught his eye until he scrolled down to a post that seemed out of place. A listing from a man in West Virginia. Vintage Pullman railcar, 1920s, weathered, needs TLC, $700 or best offer. Must arrange own transport. Beneath it, a grainy photo showed a long, rust-covered train car parked on a stretch of overgrown tracks. The windows were broken, the paint peeled to the metal, but something about it tugged at him. He stared at it for several minutes, longer than anything had held his attention in months. Pullman. His grandfather used to talk about them. The Cadillac of trains, he had said. Jeremiah remembered riding with him once when he was no more than 10. The scent of old leather, the creak of the wooden floors, the way the countryside passed by like moving paintings. He had slept on one of those bunks, held close to his grandfather's chest, feeling safe and adventurous all at once. He clicked the listing. The description was sparse but clear. Sold as is. Located in Mountain Yard. Buyer responsible for relocation. Ideal for restoration or scrap. A junk sale, basically. A bad joke to most, but to Jeremiah it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a door. Not a grand one, not gilded or promised, but a door nonetheless. He leaned back and exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest shifting, almost imperceptibly. By nightfall, he was pacing the room, whispering arguments with himself. "You're too old for this. You got no place to move it to. What the hell are you thinking?" The louder voice, the one that usually stopped him, reminded him of all the ways it could go wrong. The smaller voice, the one he hadn't heard in a long time, simply asked, "And what if it's not?" Jeremiah opened the metal box again. The deed, the old land. It hadn't been touched in decades. He remembered being there as a child, watching squirrels dart between the trees, helping his grandfather chop wood. The memory was buried beneath years of concrete and city soot, but it came alive now like a flare in the dark. Maybe the train car could go there. Maybe he could live inside it. Maybe he could build something, not just for shelter, but for himself. The next morning, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to the seller. A tired-sounding man answered, surprised that someone was interested. "It's yours if you can move it," he said. The second was to a transport company. The quote made Jeremiah wince, but it was possible, barely. The third was to a county clerk's office in North Carolina, confirming the lot was still in his name. He spent the next 3 days selling everything he had left. The television, his watch, even Linda's old sewing machine. Some things he kept, a few clothes, a flashlight, her letters. When the money came through, he wired the payment for the rail car and signed the delivery papers. His heart pounded as he did it, unsure whether it was courage or insanity. Maybe both. On the morning of his departure, he stood in the empty apartment for the last time. The radiator was silent now. The walls echoed his footsteps. He picked up his duffel bag and opened the front door. As he stepped into the cold morning air, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not joy, not yet, but something softer than grief, the faintest outline of purpose. The train car was waiting, a rusted relic from another time, but so was he. The truck groaned as it labored up the final gravel incline, wheels spitting loose rock behind it as the forest closed in on both sides. Jeremiah sat stiffly in the passenger seat, knuckles white as they clutched the strap of his duffel bag. He had barely spoken for the past hour, eyes fixed ahead, heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Behind them, secured to a flatbed trailer hitched to the truck, the Pullman car loomed like a ghost out of time, long, rusted, weather-beaten, a relic been dragged into the present. The driver, a young man with mirrored sunglasses and a chewing habit, leaned out the window and spat before grunting, "We're close. You said the entrance is past the bend?" Jeremiah nodded, throat dry. "Right up there. Watch for the rusted gate." They rounded the bend, and there it was, barely visible beneath creeping vines and waist-high grass. A bent, chain-link gate sagged on its hinges, one side half swallowed by the earth, the other flapping lazily in the breeze. Behind it, a narrow dirt road carved a path through the trees, leading deeper into the wooded property his grandfather had once cherished. The driver slowed, squinting. "You sure this is it?" Jeremiah offered a thin smile. "As sure as I'll ever be." The truck bumped forward, crunching over forgotten gravel and fallen branches. Trees arched overhead, forming a canopy that filtered the afternoon sun into patches of golden light. Birds scattered at the sound of the engine, and somewhere in the distance water trickled faintly. Perhaps the creek he remembered from childhood. They pulled into a small clearing at the heart of the land. The spot where the old cabin had once stood was now only a flat patch of earth dotted with stones and wild moss. A few warped boards remained near the base of a collapsed chimney, the final bones of what had been. Jeremiah stepped down from the cab, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground as he surveyed the place. It was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply larger now, heavier with time and wear. But it was still here, still his. The driver cut the engine and climbed down. "You want it off here?" Jeremiah looked around slowly, then pointed toward the edge of the clearing where the trees gave way to a strip of half-sunken rail track, remnants of the spur line that had once connected the land to a distant town. "Right there," he said, "on the old rails." The process was not graceful. The trailer had trouble aligning with the uneven track, and the winch groaned in protest as the car was dragged into place. Rust flaked off in clouds. One of the rear wheels locked, and the driver had to adjust the angle twice before the car finally settled with a final metallic creak, nestled into the forest as if it had always belonged. Jeremiah stood alone as the truck disappeared down the road, the sound of the engine fading until there was only wind and birdsong. He turned to face the Pullman car. It was worse than the photos. The exterior was a patchwork of rust and faded paint, layers of brown and orange streaked with soot. The windows, or what remained of them, were jagged teeth of glass framed by rotten rubber seals. The door hung slightly ajar on its hinges, one corner bent inward as though something had rammed it decades ago. Vines had crept up along the underside, clawing at the base like fingers desperate to pull it into the earth. He approached slowly, placing a hand against the metal. It was cold, rough, unyielding, but solid. Beneath the decay, the bones of the structure were intact. He felt them the way a mechanic feels the frame of an old car, listening not with ears, but with memory. He stepped inside. The air hit him like a wall, stale, musty, sharp with mold and metal. Dust swirled in the light seeping through broken windows. The floor groaned beneath his feet, and something small, mouse maybe, skittered away into the shadows. He could see remnants of the original layout. Twin seats bolted to the floor, their cushions long since shredded by time and vermin. Iron luggage racks still clinging to the walls overhead. A brass sconce, tarnished and dangling. He walked slowly through the narrow aisle, eyes adjusting to the gloom. There were bottles in the corners, scraps of fabric, old soda cans, graffiti scrawled across the walls in faded marker. The car had been used by vagrants, teens, trespassers, but abandoned again and again. It bore the weight of those lost nights. At the rear, he found a splintered cabinet half collapsed, and above it, a small rectangular window. He peered through it and saw the trees swaying gently beyond. It was peaceful in a strange way, this rusted skeleton sitting quietly in a forgotten patch of earth, waiting. That night, Jeremiah unrolled his sleeping bag in the center of the car, near what had once been a stove. He laid out his few possessions, a flashlight, a book, Linda's letters, a tin cup. He lit a small battery lantern and hung it from one of the overhead hooks. Its dim glow cast flickering shadows on the warped walls. He did not sleep well. The night was cold, colder than he had expected, and the wind moaned through the gaps in the car like a voice crying out from the forest. Every sound startled him: the creak of metal, the groan of old wood, the skitter of unseen paws in the dark. He pulled his jacket tighter, curled on his side, and whispered Linda's name into the hollow silence. When he drifted off, it was into dreams laced with memory. Her laughter in the kitchen, their son running through sprinklers, the heavy weight of her hand in his as the monitor flatlined. He woke before dawn with tears on his cheeks, the sky outside still clinging to its final stars. His breath fogged in the air. He sat up, bones aching, joints stiff. The lantern had died in the night. His body felt older than it ever had, used up, drained, but something deeper stirred beneath the fatigue, the shape of resolve. He stood and looked around at the car once more. It was broken, filthy, forgotten, but so was he. And yet here they were, together. He moved to the door and stepped outside, the morning air sharp in his lungs. Mist hung low over the forest floor and dew glistened on every leaf. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, collecting stones, measuring with his steps, planning. He made a list in his head: clean the inside, clear the windows, patch the roof, seal the floor. One task at a time, one day at a time. By midday, he had built a small fire near the tracks and boiled water for tea in a blackened tin cup. He washed his face with cold creek water and began to sweep out the car with a salvaged broom he had brought from Detroit. Dust rose in clouds, coating his throat and eyes, but he didn't stop. He worked until his arms burned and his shirt clung to his skin. When he paused, sweat ran down his temple, but the floor beneath his feet was visible, solid, real. He ate canned beans and bread. He drank water from the creek, purified with iodine tablets. He began piling discarded debris near the edge of the clearing: broken metal, splintered wood, bottles. He sorted usable pieces: old bolts, hinges, chunks of paneling. He started a pile labeled possible. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and painted the car in hues of orange and gold, Jeremiah sat on the steps of the Pullman and looked out at the land. It was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. He didn't know what would come of this place. He didn't know if it would hold through the winter or if he'd last more than a month in the woods alone. But for the first time in years he had a plan, a direction, a thing to build, however small. And it was enough. Morning arrived with a low-hanging mist that clung to the trees like old memories. Jeremiah stood outside the Pullman car, his breath fogging in the cool air as he surveyed the clearing around him. The scent of pine needles and damp earth hung heavy, grounding him in the here and now. The fire he had kept through the night had burned down to gray coals, and he used a stick to stir it gently, coaxing a last flicker from the ash. He had made it through another night. It wasn't much: no insulation, no running water, no electricity. But, for the first time in a long time, Jeremiah felt something close to pride. Not in what the railcar currently was, but in what it could be. He saw it not with tired eyes, but with imagination, the way a sculptor sees a statue within stone. The same metal walls that once trapped cold and darkness could one day hold warmth, light, even peace. He believed that. He had to. After breakfast, crackers, canned peaches, and lukewarm tea, he began pulling apart the heap of rotted furniture and scrap he had piled at the back of the rail car. Some of the debris was unsalvageable: torn cushions soaked through with mildew, panels warped beyond repair, and metal bars bent at impossible angles. But there were pieces he could use. He sorted them into neat piles: wood to be sanded, metal to be straightened, fabrics that might be washed and repurposed. He moved carefully. His joints weren't what they used to be, and every twist of his back or kneel to the floor was accompanied by a dull, familiar ache. He had never known how much of himself he had given away in those 30 years on the assembly line until there was nothing left to hold up the machine. Still, he moved with purpose. He worked until his fingers throbbed, until the sweat soaked through his shirt, until the sharp morning air turned to the golden breath of afternoon. Around midday, while clearing out a storage alcove at the rear of the rail car, Jeremiah found a metal plate loose against the wall. Beneath it, dusty and half-hidden, was a wooden crate, heavier than expected. He wrestled it free and dragged it into the light. The hinges groaned when he opened it, revealing a trove of hand tools: screwdrivers, hammers, chisels, files. At first he thought someone must have hidden it years ago, but as he wiped away the grime from the inner lid, he saw the initials carved into the wood: W.B. William Brooks, his grandfather. Jeremiah sank onto the floor, fingers trembling as he picked up a battered, wooden-handled hammer. He remembered this. Remembered holding it with his small boy hands, his grandfather guiding his grip. There were other tools, too: pliers, a handsaw, even a level, still with its air bubble perfectly centered. But what stopped him was the notebook wedged into the corner of the crate. It was thick, the pages yellowed and curling, bound in cracked leather. On the front, notes, summer of 1972. He flipped it open, scanning the page after page of neat, cursive handwriting. Most of it detailed repair work, roof patching techniques, planting strategies for the land, how to align fencing, but interspersed were thoughts, reflections, lessons, half philosophy, half how-to. The forest will always outlive the house. Build with humility. If you fix something with care, it will carry your handprint longer than your name. A home isn't four walls. It's the space you protect with your effort. Jeremiah closed the book gently, his chest tight. The weight of legacy was not a burden. It was a tether. A line thrown from the past to the present, connecting him to something that had not yet died. That evening, he began work on sealing the worst gaps in the railcar walls. He used scrap paneling where he could, covering the holes that let the night wind scream through. He patched the floor with 2x4s salvaged from a collapsed shed at the far end of the property. He didn't have power tools, only a handsaw and patience, but the rhythm of the work soothed him. Saw, measure, nail, repeat, saw, measure, nail. By nightfall, he had cleared enough space to stretch a line of wire hooks along one wall for hanging tools and clothes. The rail car felt just slightly less like a shell and slightly more like a workshop. He lit a candle, warmed a can of stew over a small propane burner, and sat on an upturned crate to eat. The silence didn't feel as empty. It felt earned. The following day, he made the trip into town. The nearest store was a 20-minute drive down winding roads, nestled beside a gas station and a post office. Jeremiah parked his beat-up sedan, his last remaining link to city life, and stepped inside the hardware store. The scent of sawdust and rubber greeted him. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He moved through the aisles with a clear list in his head: nails, sandpaper, wood glue, work gloves. As he browsed, he became aware of eyes following him. A woman behind the counter, a middle-aged clerk in a red vest, watched him with a neutral expression that held the faintest undertone of suspicion. Another customer, a man in hunting gear, paused by the exit and gave Jeremiah a once-over before walking out. He felt it like a chill in his spine. The silent question, unspoken but loud in the air. What's he doing here? At the register, the clerk didn't smile, didn't ask about his project, didn't say, "Have a nice day." She just rang him up, took his cash, and gave him his change without meeting his eyes. Jeremiah took his bag and left without a word. Back in the car, he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, breathing slow and deep. It wasn't new. He'd lived enough years to know the difference between curiosity and judgment. He didn't let it take root. He just drove back, the forest gradually welcoming him again. That evening, as he unloaded supplies near the tracks, he noticed something out of place. Movement in the trees, a flicker of color, a soft rustle. He looked up and saw a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Thin, scrappy, wearing a backpack, too large for his shoulders. He didn't move, just watched. Jeremiah raised a hand in quiet greeting. The boy blinked, took a step back, then turned and disappeared into the trees. The next day, the boy returned. He didn't speak at first, just stood near the same spot, watching Jeremiah plane down an old piece of wood. After a while, he crept closer. Jeremiah didn't press him. He worked steadily, occasionally glancing toward the boy but saying nothing. Eventually, the boy stepped up to the edge of the Pullman. "You living there?" he asked. Jeremiah looked at him, setting down his tool. "Trying to." The boy nodded slowly. "Looks like a train." "It was, long time ago." There was a pause. "I'm Trevor." "Jeremiah." Another pause. "My mom said someone moved in. Thought it was a crazy person." Jeremiah smiled faintly. "Maybe she's not wrong." Trevor smiled back. From that day on, Trevor became a regular presence. He would appear late in the afternoon, sometimes with a snack in his bag, a granola bar, a juice box, and watch Jeremiah work. Eventually, he began asking questions. Could he hold the hammer? Could he help measure? Could he learn how to saw straight? Jeremiah taught him, patient and firm, correcting his grip, showing him how to respect the tool. Trevor soaked it up like sunlight. He was a quiet kid, but smart, and his fascination with the train car grew each day. When Trevor didn't show up one afternoon, Jeremiah felt a strange hollowness. But the next day, the boy returned with something wrapped in foil. "My mom made sweet cornbread," he said. "She said to say thanks for keeping me busy." Jeremiah took it with a nod. "Tell her she's welcome any time." He didn't expect her to come, but that weekend, a tall woman in a blue sweatshirt and jeans walked into the clearing, arms crossed, eyes wary. Trevor walked beside her, bouncing slightly with excitement. "Miss Ellie," she said, "Trevor's mom." Jeremiah stood up from the step he was building. Jeremiah Brooks, pleasure. She scanned the clearing, the Pullman, the neat stacks of lumber, the careful organization of tools. Her gaze softened slightly. "He talks about this place all the time," she said. "I had to see it for myself." "You're always welcome," Jeremiah replied. She smiled just faintly and turned to her son. "Don't forget your homework." Trevor rolled his eyes. As they walked back toward the road, Jeremiah felt something shift in the air, a crack in the shell that had formed around this place. A connection. That night, he sat by the fire with his grandfather's journal in his lap, Trevor's hammer beside him, and a full belly from cornbread and beans. The train car no longer felt like a burden. It was becoming something else entirely. Autumn came to the forest in slow, deliberate strokes. The air turned crisp, and the light shifted into a golden softness that filtered through the thinning trees like the glow of an old memory. Jeremiah rose each morning before the sun, stretching stiff muscles and rolling his shoulders as the first chill reached under his collar. Smoke curled from the stovepipe at the top of the Pullman car, a thin gray ribbon that marked life where once there had been only rust and rot. Inside, the transformation was steady. Not miraculous, not sudden, but real. The floors had been scrubbed clean and patched, with sections covered in warm, sanded planks. One end of the railcar now served as a sleeping area, a cot with a thick wool blanket, shelves above holding a tin lantern, a stack of books, and a photo of Linda smiling at a picnic table in the early 80s. The other end had been turned into a sitting and work space, where a handmade wooden table rested against the wall beneath the largest window, now refitted with salvaged glass panes that let in light like liquid. Curtains, sewn by Miss Ellie from old fabric scraps, framed the view. On the wall beside the door, Jeremiah had mounted his grandfather's tools with care, as if each one was an heirloom in a museum. Outside, he had cleared a path from the track to the dirt road, laying flat stones and lining the edges with river rocks gathered from the nearby creek. He built steps leading to the rail car's sliding door, added a small platform for sitting in the afternoon sun, and hung a wind chime that sang softly with the breeze. Even the outside of the Pullman had changed. The rust had been scrubbed, the metal sanded and primed, and layer by layer Jeremiah had painted it in hues of deep forest green and old brass gold. It gleamed now beneath the trees, not like something new, but something respected, like a story retold with care. It was on one of those bright mornings, with birds chirping nearby and leaves crunching underfoot, that Trevor asked his first real question. "Did you ever ride one of these, for real?" Jeremiah looked up from where he was polishing one of the brass lantern hooks, a faint smile touching his lips. "A long time ago. My grandfather took me once. I was about your age." Trevor's eyes widened. What was it like? Jeremiah sat down on the wooden crate beside him, brushing sawdust from his jeans. It was loud. The tracks rattled under your feet. Everything smelled like oil and iron. But it was exciting. Magical, even. Back then, riding a train meant you were going somewhere, and everyone, white, black, rich, poor, they all shared that sense of journey, though not always equally. Trevor frowned. "What do you mean?" Jeremiah paused. The weight of history sat heavily in his chest. Back then, people who looked like me had to sit in certain cars. Sometimes the worst ones. Hot, loud, uncomfortable. That's just how it was. Even the Pullman cars, built by black craftsmen, were off limits to most black passengers. We built them, but we couldn't ride in them like everyone else. Trevor was quiet for a moment. "That's not fair." "No," Jeremiah said softly. "It wasn't." They sat there in silence for a while, the wind moving gently around them as if giving space for what had been said to settle. That evening, Miss Ellie came by with a basket of sweet potatoes and carrots from her garden. She stood with her arms crossed, watching as Jeremiah and Trevor worked together to repair a cracked window pane. "He's got the bug," she said after a while. "I haven't seen him this focused on anything since his father passed." Jeremiah looked over at the boy, who was measuring a wood plank with intense concentration. "He's a good kid." "He is. And I thank you for showing up, for being here." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Word of the train car's transformation began to spread through the small town. First, it was Ellie's friends at church, then a few folks from the local co-op. One afternoon, a group of high schoolers rode their bikes out to see The Train in the Woods, and stood in awe at the brass fixtures, the restored benches, the tin signs from the 1930s that Jeremiah had salvaged and rehung with pride. He didn't invite them in at first, unsure of their intent, but their quiet respect softened him. They began to return, bringing their own touches. One painted a wooden sign that read, Hope Line Est, 1927. Another brought a collection of railroad postcards from his grandfather's attic. Jeremiah tacked them onto a board inside the car, forming a kind of living museum. One boy, a tall, lanky student named Lucas, came back with a gift, an old oil lamp with a broken base. Figured you might know what to do with it, he said. Jeremiah fixed it within the week. Soon enough, people began stopping by not just out of curiosity, but with purpose. Someone asked for help fixing a chair. Another, a single mother, needed assistance replacing a door hinge. A retired couple brought canned peaches and sat on the platform to hear Jeremiah tell stories about the history of Pullman porters and how they shaped the early black middle class through dignity and back-breaking labor. It turned into something more than he could have imagined. Not just a home, not just a project. It was becoming a place of meaning. Yet, even in this season of quiet growth, the past refused to stay buried. Jeremiah hadn't spoken of his son in years. Not to Ellie, not to Trevor, not even aloud to himself. But one night, as he sorted through an old toolbox, he found a photo tucked into the corner beneath a rusted wrench. It was worn and creased, but the image was clear. Moloch, 17, in a cap and gown, his mother's arm around his shoulders, Jeremiah beside her, smiling but tired. He sat staring at it for a long time. The boy in the picture had grown into a man somewhere out there in the world. A man who had once looked at his father with both love and fury. Their last conversation played in his mind like a tape he could never erase. You gave everything to her and left me with nothing. She was dying, son. And what was I doing, living alone in my own house? I didn't know how to do both. The silence that followed that final argument had stretched across years. He had thought of calling, of writing, of apologizing, but pride and guilt formed a wall too thick to scale. Now, holding that picture, he felt the ache of distance more than ever. The next day, as he hammered a new bracket into place near the door, a weathered envelope fell from the shelf above. It had been tucked into the pages of Linda's old Bible. Inside was a letter, unfinished, meant for Moloch. It had no date, only a few lines in Linda's delicate handwriting. If you're reading this, then I'm already gone. But please know your father loved you more than he could say. Sometimes love is quiet, son. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice. Be gentle with him if you can. Jeremiah stood still for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. That night, he sat at his small table, lit the lantern, and opened a blank page in his journal. He began to write. Not a masterpiece, not an apology with all the right words, but something honest. A story of where he had gone, what he had done, what he had built. Not from money or success, but from pieces of memory, stubbornness, and need. He didn't know if Moloch would ever read it, or care. But it was time to write it anyway. He folded the pages carefully and slid them into an envelope, scrawling a name he hadn't written in years across the front. Then he placed it beside the lantern, let the candle burn low, and sat quietly with the sound of the forest breathing around him. Outside, the wind caught the wind chime and the Pullman car hummed like an old engine warming to life. The envelope sat on the table for 3 days. Jeremiah didn't touch it. He saw it every morning when he lit the lamp, every evening when he laid down to sleep. Its presence was like a quiet guest in the room, one that asked no questions, made no demands, yet filled the space with expectation. He had written the letter in a fit of clarity, fueled by emotion and late-night stillness, but the act of sending it required something else entirely. Courage, maybe, or humility, or a willingness to reopen a wound he had spent years trying to ignore. He wasn't sure yet if he was ready, so he focused on what he did know how to do. He worked. From sunrise to sundown, he made things better, stronger, cleaner. He built a pair of steps leading up to the rear door of the Pullman car, with a sturdy railing and a place to sit. He scrubbed the brass nameplate on the side of the car until the letters gleamed through the patina. Pullman Standard Number 407. He arranged the salvaged train benches around a small circular table he had fashioned from a discarded cable spool and lacquered until it shone like maple. He hung a small sign above the front window, hand-carved from cedar and painted in bold, steady letters, Hope Line. The rail car no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a destination. Word of the place spread further. Ellie's friend from church, a retired librarian named Mrs. Henderson, asked if she could donate a few old books. When she arrived with 3 full boxes of gently worn volumes, ranging from Mark Twain to Baldwin, Jeremiah cleared a shelf immediately and began organizing them by hand, spines outward like a proper reading room. A woman from the community garden brought fresh herbs in clay pots, which he arranged outside the railcar's steps. 2 teenage girls delivered a colorful quilt they had sewn together at school, draping it over the cot inside with pride. Visitors became common. People arrived not just out of curiosity now, but with purpose. They brought gifts, stayed to talk, and sometimes even returned with their families. Someone suggested Jeremiah hold a storytelling night. He didn't say yes right away, but when a third neighbor mentioned it in the same week, he finally agreed. On a cool Friday evening in early October, the woods filled with the soft shuffle of footsteps and the hum of voices. Jeremiah had placed battery-powered lanterns along the path, their warm yellow glow lighting the trail from the road to the train car. Folding chairs ringed the clearing. A fire pit crackled in the center, its glow casting dancing shadows on the trees. Inside the Pullman, the table was cleared and covered with hot cider, cornbread, and Ellie's famous molasses cookies. Jeremiah stood at the doorway as people filtered in. He greeted each one with a handshake or a nod, smiling quietly as their eyes widened at the interior. Wood-paneled walls, hanging lanterns, curtains fluttering softly at the windows, shelves of books and tools and history. It wasn't grand, but it was deeply personal, and it made people feel something. He began the evening with a story about his grandfather, a tale of how he once built a canoe from scrap wood and stubbornness, and how it nearly sank halfway across the lake. The crowd laughed. Later, Ellie told a story about a Thanksgiving dinner ruined by a wayward possum. One by one, others shared memories, jokes, and anecdotes. The firelight grew lower, and the air cooled, but no one left. When the last of the guests drifted off into the night, Jeremiah stood alone in the clearing, hands in his pockets, watching the smoke trail into the stars. He felt full, not of food or pride, but of presence. For the first time in a very long time, he felt undeniably connected. Not just to this place, but to others. That weekend, the local elementary school called. One of the teachers had heard about the Pullman project through a student's parents and wanted to know if Jeremiah might be willing to host a field trip. "They're learning about American history," she said, "railroads, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. It might be good for them to see a piece of that up close." He hesitated at first. He didn't think of himself as someone who lectured children, but Trevor was quick to advocate. "You already teach me," he said. "You just don't talk like a teacher." And so, on a Wednesday morning, A yellow school bus bounced up the gravel road and stopped at the edge of the clearing. 24 children spilled out, their faces a mix of awe and excitement. Jeremiah welcomed them at the base of the steps, one hand resting on the carved railing, the other shading his eyes from the sun. He showed them the wheels, the restored benches, the brass luggage racks. He told them about the men who built these cars, craftsmen, engineers, and porters, many of them black, who worked with skill and pride during an era that offered little recognition. He explained how Pullman porters formed the backbone of one of the first black labor unions, how they passed information along the rails that would later feed the fires of the civil rights movement. The children listened, wide-eyed, respectful. A few took notes. One little girl, standing by the open door, looked up at Jeremiah and asked, "Is this your house?" He smiled. "It's more than that now." That night, after the bus had disappeared down the hill and the children's voices had faded into memory, Jeremiah finally picked up the envelope. The post office in town was quiet the next morning. He stood in line behind a woman mailing birthday gifts, and when it was his turn, he handed the letter to the clerk with a simple, "First class, please." He walked out into the sunlight, feeling lighter and heavier all at once. In the days that followed, he returned to his routines. He cleared fallen branches from the trail, repaired a leak in the stovepipe, sanded a bench until it felt like velvet beneath his fingertips. He wrote in his journal more often. Short notes, fragments of thoughts, memories. He began drawing plans for a small rain catch system. He baked cornbread from scratch. He taught Trevor how to sharpen a knife, how to split kindling, how to sand against the grain and not with it. But part of him was waiting. He didn't know what kind of response, if any, might come. The letter hadn't included a plea or a demand, just truth, offered plainly and without expectation. He had told Malik about the Pullman car, about the people, the work, the purpose. He had told him about Linda's letter and her love. He had told him that he missed him and that he was sorry for all the ways he hadn't known how to be a father when it mattered most. 10 days passed, then 12. It was the 13th day, sunny with a soft wind, that Jeremiah was outside, kneeling by the herb pots, when he heard footsteps approaching from the road. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, and turned. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, lean, with broad shoulders and eyes the color of dark mahogany. His hair was close-cropped, streaked faintly with gray. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, dust on his boots, hesitation in his posture. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man spoke, voice low and rough. "Dad?" Jeremiah couldn't answer. His throat closed, his heart pounded in his ears. Malik stepped forward. "I got your letter," he said. "I didn't know if I should come, but He stopped, swallowed hard. "I wanted to see." Jeremiah opened his mouth, but the words failed him. He took a step forward instead, another, and then they were close, arms almost brushing. "I'm sorry," Malik whispered. "So am I," Jeremiah said, his voice breaking. They embraced without ceremony, without words, with all the weight of years between them dissolving into the fall air. Later, they sat on the wooden platform beneath the chime, sharing warm cider in silence. Malik looked around at the train car, the flowers, the people filtering past in the distance. "You really built all this?" he asked. "With help," Jeremiah said. "Friends, neighbors, strangers, your mother, in a way." Malik nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." Jeremiah looked at him, at the boy who had become a man, at the man who had come home. And in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before, that redemption didn't require perfection, only presence, only the willingness to try again. As the sun slipped behind the trees, casting the rail car in amber light, Jeremiah felt it fully. The warmth, the forgiveness, the joy. His home had been built from rust and memory, but now it welcomed the world. The following morning dawned with a softness that only early spring could offer. Dew clung to every leaf and blade of grass, and a faint mist curled above the treetops like breath from the forest itself. The Pullman car stood quietly at the edge of the clearing, its painted green sides catching the first light of day, the golden trim glowing faintly beneath the rising sun. Birds stirred in the canopy above, and somewhere beyond the clearing, the creek gurgled as it wove its way through the roots of old trees. The world was alive with the sound of renewal, and Jeremiah Brooks felt it stir in his bones as he stepped outside into the light. He found Moloch, already awake, standing beside the fire pit and poking the embers with a stick. He wore the same jacket from the day before, but his posture was looser, his face less guarded. They exchanged a nod. No need for words just yet. Jeremiah knelt to add kindling to the coals, then coaxed a flame from the sleeping warmth. As the fire rose, so did the scent of pine and ash, mingling with the clean air. When the water boiled in the dented kettle, Jeremiah poured 2 cups of strong black coffee and handed one to his son. They sat side by side on the edge of the platform, watching the morning unfold in quiet togetherness. "Didn't sleep much," Moloch said after a while. "Me neither," Jeremiah replied. They let silence settle between them again, not awkward now, but companionable, like 2 travelers who had arrived at the same station after long, separate journeys. When Moloch finally stood and dusted off his jeans, he glanced toward the rail car and said, "Show me the rest?" Jeremiah led him through the space slowly, letting his son take it in without explanation. Moloch moved with reverence, touching the worn woodwork, pausing at the shelves filled with books and tools, crouching to examine the repurposed stove and the brass hooks that lined the walls. He ran his hand along the polished table, admired the hand-carved railings, and finally paused before the photo of Linda that hung in a simple wooden frame above the cot. "She would have loved this," he said quietly. Jeremiah's throat tightened. "I think so too." They spent the day together, not in discussion, but in action. Moloch helped reinforce a section of the rear wall where a leak had formed during the last rain. He held boards while Jeremiah hammered, sawed wood while his father measured. Their movements synchronized without effort, the rhythm of shared labor smoothing the jagged edges left by years of absence. They broke only for a quick lunch of sandwiches and apples, which they ate on the steps, squinting against the sun. By afternoon, Trevor appeared at the edge of the clearing, a wide grin stretching across his face when he spotted Moloch. "You came back," he called. Jeremiah introduced them properly, and the 2 quickly fell into easy conversation. Moloch asked about Trevor's projects, listened to the boys' enthusiastic descriptions of every corner of the Pullman, and laughed at the stories Trevor told about the early days of the renovation, like the time a raccoon snuck in through the roof and refused to leave. Miss Ellie arrived soon after, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a checkered towel and wearing a knowing smile that deepened when she saw Moloch. "You must be the son I've heard about," she said. "Didn't think you were real." Moloch chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Most days I wasn't, but I'm trying." She passed him the casserole. "Then you're welcome here." That evening, more people arrived, neighbors, school children, elders from the church. drawn not by a formal invitation but by the magnetic pull of a place transformed by care. Lanterns lit the path. Folding chairs surrounded the fire pit. Plates of food appeared on the table inside the Pullman, brought by different hands, different families. There was no schedule, no speeches, just laughter, conversation, the clink of dishes, and the flicker of flames. Music played from a portable radio, a blues tune from the 50s, and someone began to hum along. Jeremiah stood on the steps of the rail car, a mug of cider warm in his hands, and watched it all unfold. Malik leaned against the doorframe behind him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You did this," he said after a moment. Jeremiah shook his head. "Not alone. But it started with you." They stood in silence, listening to the voices of people who had once been strangers, now swapping stories like old friends. "Are you going to stay?" Jeremiah asked. Malik hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to come back, help out, be around." "That's enough," Jeremiah said. The next morning, the guests were gone, and the forest had reclaimed its hush. Malik had already packed his bag but lingered near the trail, hesitant to leave. Jeremiah handed him a small wooden box with a brass latch. "Your mother's," he said. "She wanted you to have it one day." Malik opened it slowly. Inside were letters, photos, and a delicate locket, Linda's favorite. He closed it gently and looked up with glistening eyes. "Thank you." Jeremiah nodded, too full to speak. After Malik left, the Pullman car didn't feel empty. It felt grounded, rooted. A place that had held sorrow now held memory and possibility in equal measure. The days grew longer. Spring greened the forest. Trevor brought friends who wanted to help build a rain catch system. Ellie started a community book swap with the Pullman's growing collection. A local artist painted a mural on the side of the rail car, an image of a tree growing from train tracks, branches spreading wide, cradling stars. Jeremiah added one final touch, a wooden plaque near the front step carved with steady hands and sealed with oil. It read, "Pullman, Hope 407, for those starting from scratch." One afternoon, a group of students gathered at the foot of the platform, notebooks in hand. Their teacher, a kind-eyed woman in glasses, introduced Jeremiah as the steward of a living history. He didn't know what to say to that, so he invited them inside, poured lemonade into tin cups, and told them about rust and loss and how even a man with nothing can build something that matters. He didn't speak of tragedy. He spoke of change, of hands that fix what's broken, of how sometimes the past isn't a burden, but a blueprint. And when the students left and the forest grew quiet again, Jeremiah sat by the fire and opened his journal. He wrote, "You can't undo what's been done, but you can choose what grows from it." He closed the book, looked toward the old tracks that once led nowhere, and saw a future rolling quietly forward. The rail car stood behind him like a heart beating steadily beneath trees, its walls full of stories, its roof open to the sky. It had been forgotten once, left to rot, but not anymore. It was home, and it was ready for the next soul in search of a place to begin. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated with all the latest content. Be sure to watch our next videos and explore other stories on the channel. And please share this video with your friends. It really helps us grow and bring you more great stories. Thanks for watching.